Pirate gaming has always been something of a fascination of mine, because it really is a gateway into a whole different world and industry than that we're actually accustomed to. I've always had a fascination with these weird knockoff bootleg cartridges. I mean, this is why I made an entire series about it. And this was the first Pirate Multicart I managed to play all the way through, again in said series. Go watch it if you want to actually see in depth what's on this thing. And I gotta say, I think this is a pretty interesting cartridge. And it's a very special cartridge for me because not only was it the first cartridge as decided by the Discord that I should look into, which, you know, if you want to figure out what the next one's gonna be, go support the show and, you know, get your voice heard. But this was also the very first pirate cartridge I ever owned. I actually got it in a bundle with a second one, but it's a far more noteworthy cartridge than that as well. This is 401 Real Game by Coolboy, also known as that one NES Famicom cartridge that has the Resident Evil 5 box art on it, and I gotta admit this is a pretty important cartridge for a lot of different reasons. Not only is it my first multicart, it kind of marked a shift in multicarts as well. See, multicarts originally, while they weren't necessarily one-off experiences, they were usually produced in fairly small runs. If you want to find a specific multicart that you'd ever see out there, you'd have an absolute monster of a time trying to find it. This, at least as far as I can tell, was sort of a shift in the industry where they started mass-producing multicarts more and more. If you look up this cartridge on eBay, you can find it along with the other cart that I got with it, because they're usually sold together, pretty readily and easily. That just shows a tone and a shift for the industry as a whole, which I find to be quite fascinating. But let's talk a little bit more about that, because this is a multicart, it doesn't have a story. But I can talk about the story and history of multicarts. See, these things are typically made in places like China, Taiwan, Russia, places that never sold the NES or Famicom. And that didn't necessarily mean that the people who lived there didn't want to play video games. Well, what are they going to do? There's very clearly a need for an industry there that just isn't. Well, they would take an NES, they'd reverse engineer it, and release it as its own unique thing, also known as a Famiclone, because it is a clone of the Famicom. And in Russia's case, they actually ended up producing what a lot of people consider to be the gold standard of Famiclones, called the Dendy. And that was actually a console that was so important that not only did it sell fairly well and is pretty well coveted by people that collect Famiclone stuff, but it got its own TV show where it reviewed hardware for this thing, which actually led to a really awkward moment where the reviewer mistook a clone game that was stolen from a real game as the real game that was being stolen from later on. You can find video on YouTube of this too. Shoutouts to Dendy the New Reality. Seriously, it's fascinating, you should check this out. But when you create a console that, you know, is proprietary, but you don't have games for it, well then suddenly you have to make your own games. And while sure, I guess you could attempt to smuggle Famicom carts over the border, it'd probably be much easier just to, you know, make your own. And so they did, and they created some interesting stuff. Pirate multicarts like this are not only a compilation, but this one specifically is like the textbook of how these things work in pretty much all regards. If you ever wanted a multicart, this one is a great introduction because it does pretty much everything every multicart does, but to the extreme. Now what do I mean by that? Well, it's pretty common to see multicarts that boast very high game counts. Ones that have 1,000 games, ones that have 100,000 games, ones that have 99 trillion games on it. But if you actually play those games, you'll usually see something like stadium events broken into every single individual event as a separate game and then just listed repeatedly. Seeing repeats on multicarts is very, very common, which is why typically when you look for multicarts, you look for games that have lower game counts, simply by virtue of you're less likely to get as much repeats and more of a unique experience. Well, when this game says 400, it means that. There's actually 403 games on this. This is an upgraded revision of the original 400 cart that contains 3 new hacks of existing games on the cartridge based around, I think, Japanese TV shows, as far as I can tell. But there's very few repeats on this cartridge. There's maybe 5 or 6, if that. And that's pretty noteworthy, especially since this cartridge again boasts 400 different games. It actually hits that number pretty close, and that alone is pretty interesting. But this individual cartridge features a lot of things that other multi-carts would do. Now, when I said this cartridge does everything that other carts do to the extreme, I really meant it. This cartridge has a lot of games to it, but it basically exists as sort of a compendium of what every standard multi-cart out there does, just with a bunch more games and on a much larger scale. As it stands, last I checked, this was the single largest multi-cart in terms of sheer data size out there. And while I've seen one or two multi-carts that have a higher game count than this, that was only on a technicality because it was two multi-carts sort of glued together into one. But because this is basically your standard multi-cart experience, well, that's a good and a bad thing. For one thing, there's a lot of games that have a very small data size. And while that's not inherently bad, that means there's going to be a lot of very simple games on here, which means that you might get bored with them pretty quick, but at the same time, you're going to find some stuff that you've never seen before. You'll be constantly running into games that have all their copyright information and a lot of title screen information removed. And if the case happens to be with a Capcom game, well, they had a fancy anti-piracy measure in that if that happens, it gets set to super hard mode. You'll run to games that are like weirdly fan-hacked, but only sort of halfway, like the Karopi game, which seems to only sort of half be in English, so maybe it's corrupted. You'll run into weird games that are not in consistent regions. For example, Super Mario and Blaster Master, two amazing games on this cartridge, are actually from the PAL region, which means if you play this in North America or Japan, you're going to be playing it at twice the speed, which, while certainly not unplayable, is certainly not the most enjoyable experience to be had. Yeah, a lot of care isn't necessarily taken when compiling these things by pirates. It's certainly a matter of trying to produce something rather than try and produce a quality thing. You'll run into games that are sprite hacks of other games, such as this weird copy of Bomberman that just completely changes all the sprites and stuff, except I'm pretty sure still maintains the ending that mentions Bomberman by name because, again, pirates didn't exactly do the most consistent or in-depth job out there. You also find pirate original games, and pirate original games, kind of like I mentioned all the way at the start, were games made by people usually modifying other games. Those are when you're lucky. You'll get games like Super Mario 14, which is like a copy of Armadillo but with Mario's head stapled on top of it. And if you want to see more about Armadillo, I got a review of it. Go check it out. You could run into that weird hack of Jackie Chan's Action Kung Fu that happens to also feature Mario's head over Jackie Chan's, but only half the time. You could end up running into a bad version of Championship Lode Runner, which is already not a fun game. But that's on the good spectrum of weird pirate games. This cartridge actually doesn't have a ton of those, at least the good ones. See, the good pirate original games typically end up being modified iterations of existing games. So, I mean, it's already a great game, let's just call it something else and say it's an original game. Unfortunately, when they actually go out of their way to make something wholly original, you end up getting some bad stuff out there. You can run into games made by Sachin like Metal Fighter, which is actually not too bad. Stuff like Silent Assault, again, I've reviewed that game. It's not great, but it's at least enjoyable. And that would be games made by Sachin, games that are at least interesting if nothing else. However, there are other pirate companies that make games that are far less good than Sachin, and that's saying a lot. Companies like NES Code, which happen to make some of the worst tat ever. And going back to how I said this cartridge does everything that multi-carts do but taken to the extreme, yeah, not only are there NES Code games on here, there is a lot of NES Code games on here. Like, a lot. A lot. From 300 to 400. A lot. If you've been watching my series up to this point, you'll have probably noticed that I try to give every game on this cartridge about 5 minutes of gameplay. That was up until I got to about 300, and then I just started going as fast as I possibly could through this crap, because I did the last, 100 of them in one sitting, and they're not very good. And look, NES Code, I will give you credit for Orchard Kavas, mainly because that's basically an existing game on the Intellivision that was a lot of fun. But still, I'll give you that. But most of this stuff on here is at best playable and at worst just intolerable. And it repeats a lot of its own games, which is actually also a pirate thing that happens. So, I mean, good on you for that, but this is what I don't like about this cartridge. It's a great compilation of a bunch of games that you'd expect. Super Mario, even though it's in PAL version, Ninja Gaiden, Ninja Turtles. You can find weird, awesome games like Jackie Chan's Action Kung Fu, Vice Project Doom, although it's in Japanese because, again, inconsistency. Super Spy Hunter, which is ridiculously hard to find. Arkista's Ring, and the incredible Kabuki Quantum Fighter. Again, I've got a review of at least a couple of these out there, and some of them I actually reviewed with this very cartridge. But, as incredible as some of the games are on here, and as much as you'll run into weird but incredibly awesome stuff, like Guerrilla War, a game where you play as Che Guevara and Fidel Castro fighting for Cuban revolution, or whatever, or again, something like that really awesome Keroppi game, that's basically Wagyan Land minus all the edutainment, you know, you're going to run into way more nice code games, because they take up literally a quarter of this cartridge. And that's not even including the bad, barely playable stuff that was, for the most part, published by LJN. Yeah, there's a lot of licensed crap on here. And yet, the one game LJN did make, that we got in North America, is not on this cartridge. Weird. Again, pirates are kind of inconsistent about stuff. My point is, this is a cartridge with a very large amount of games, and there's a lot of good, a lot of really weird stuff out there you may never considered, and that alone makes this worth experiencing, but it's totally weighed down on the back end with all this crap that you should never want to play, and that's a damn shame. This was also just before Pirate Multicarts had the ability to save, and because of that, a lot of games on here are arcadey by design, and I mean, that means you don't have to save, which is great, but it also goes back to a lot of games being very, very simple experiences that will be over very quickly. So if you're the kind of person who gets bored real quick, you're going to be jumping around all over the place on this thing, and you won't be committed to too much. Now, you might remember that at the start I said that I got this bundled with another game, and again, you can find that bundle pretty easily. That bundle contains a lot of the same games this one does, except it only has like 150 games on it, and it has significantly less nice code stuff. And that's why comparing the two, I think it's the game that has less content on it is honestly the better one. It decided to go for more quality than less quantity, and it created a better experience overall. But that said, if you're looking for an actual multi-cart experience, this one is pretty great for what you're getting. Now, the overall presentation to Cool Boy 401 Multicart is pretty lackluster, but like I said, it's kind of the standard for multi-carts. I've run into multi-carts that on their menus have graphics and have music sometimes that at least keep flipping between pages interesting. There are a couple games on here that change these sprites up, such as, again, this version of Bomberman Dejectile, and you know, this one actually looks pretty good, but again, it's on a case-by-case basis, and there really aren't that many games that were monkeyed with on the sprite level, which, if you're looking for an interesting pirate experience, might hurt your overall enjoyment of the cartridge, so it's worth keeping that in mind. You can also see lots and lots and lots of really bizarrely creepy faces on this cartridge, because what the hell, pirate game developers? What is with your art sense? Seriously. Audio-wise, there's really nothing to this, mainly because, again, this cartridge, the only thing original it really does is its own menu, and all it does is reuse sound effects from other stuff, so there's nothing really here. That said, if the music does sound bad, that's because this is running off a clone console as opposed to my really, really nice high-end HDMI stuff. That's also why it looks probably 99% as crappy. And if you're planning on collecting this stuff, you have to be aware of this, because not all equipment is going to be able to run this stuff. While it could run on an actual NES, provided you got an adapter or an NES version of this cartridge, I think they exist. Stuff like the Retron 5 and Retro Freak, which basically create a visual copy of the game data on there and then sort of play it digitally, they don't really work with these pirate cards as well. I've run into one or two that work on both, but it's a very, very hit and miss thing, and even if you were to take just the pure game data off this disc and insert it into those consoles, it's really inconsistent. Sometimes it won't work at all, such as with this cartridge. Other times it'll load the menu, but every time you try and select something, it'll just dump you back to the menu because I'm pretty sure it's partitioned, and sometimes it'll actually work, but that time is pretty rare. But that's just a general warning about the Retro Freak and Retron 5, and it's not even necessarily pirate multicarts that do it. I've got official games that contain multiple games on it that also don't work on those, so just a heads up. If you want to collect this stuff, you might have to invest in either an NES, Famicom, or something a little bit older that reads the direct pins off this thing. But that means your audio quality is, at least in my case, going to suffer significantly for it. Now, if you want a copy of 401 on the NES, the Resident Evil 5 game that usually comes with a Devil May Cry cartridge. Cheapest one I'm seeing right now is about $15. And this is something you should see with a lot of multi-carts. Sometimes I run into people who tend to say, oh well, this game has 100 games on it, so I'll just charge $100. That's like $1 per game. No. These pirate multi-carts, if you're paying more than like $15 per cartridge, that is way too much. And honestly, if you're gonna get the cartridge in a bundle, which from what I can tell costs about the same as buying it individually anyway, I would say that you'd probably just want to use the other cartridge. Sure, it doesn't have as many games, and yeah, it's not gonna have quite the same games, but it's a better quality cartridge by the end of it. But at the end of the day, this thing exists to show what pirate gaming is all about, and I think it does it admirably. That said, it takes up so much space with a bunch of unwanted crap that could easily have been removed, and no one would have missed it. I like this cartridge a lot. It was my start into this little venture of exploring the pirate game industry, an industry we don't really have a lot of perspective for because we never had to deal with any of the nonsense they had to make this stuff exist. They say that necessity is the mother of invention, and that is very much the case with this. If Taiwan and China and Russia had the Famicom and had the Famicom games out there, this stuff wouldn't exist. This is a gateway into seeing a different side of the world, a different side of the video games industry we don't necessarily think about all that much, and I think in that regard it does an excellent job of informing us. It's fascinating to see, and while it's certainly not the best cartridge I've ever played, I've got so many better multi-carts out there. Again, if you wanted to help decide what the next one we're going to go to is, help support the show through the PayPal or Patreon, get on the Discord and get your voice heard, because we're doing a vote real quick on this stuff. But I'm looking forward to more multi-carts that I get to do. This one was fun, and it's by far the biggest one I have, but it's not the best. That said, if you're just getting into pirate multi-carts and you want to dip your toes, well, you can get this in a bundle of 2 for about the same price as buying it individually, and this cartridge will show you exactly what pirate gaming is all about, and maybe a whole new world you'd never considered before. Ooh, that's a good move. Also suplexed. Ah, but I'm dead. Alas. Oh, and the cart messed up. That happens sometimes.